Desperate mother bear approaches rangers with a note in mouth. The contents? Prepare to be amazed. In the heart of Yellowstone National Park, where towering pines whispered ancient secrets to the wind, Ranger Michael Thompson's ordinary morning patrol transformed into one of the most extraordinary encounters of his 20-year career. The crisp autumn air carried an unusual tension that day, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up even before he spotted the massive grizzly bear lumbering toward the ranger station with deliberate, measured steps. But it wasn't the bear's presence that stopped Michael's heart. It was what she carried in her mouth, a mud-stained, crumpled piece of paper. Drawing upon years of experience, Michael remained perfectly still, his trained eyes noting every detail of this unprecedented scene. The mother bear's fur was matted with dirt and pine needles, her powerful muscles rippling beneath as she moved with an urgency that seemed almost human. Most striking were her eyes, deep pools of intelligence and desperation that locked onto Michael's with an intensity that defied everything he knew about wild animals. Behind her, partially obscured by the morning mist, two tiny cubs huddled together, unusually quiet and subdued. One of them limped noticeably, its small frame trembling with each step. The sight made Michael's chest tighten with concern, even as his mind raced to make sense of what he was witnessing. "Stay back, Amanda," he whispered to his junior ranger, who had frozen beside him on the wooden porch of the station. Amanda Parker was new to Yellowstone, fresh out of training, and he could feel her whole body tensing for flight. "Something's very wrong here." The mother bear stopped about 30 feet from the station, and in a movement that would later be described as almost reverential, she gently placed the paper on the ground. Then, defying every natural instinct, she took several steps backward, her eyes never leaving Michael's face. "I've never seen anything like this in all my years," Michael murmured, his voice barely audible. The morning silence was broken only by the soft whimpers of the injured cub and the distant call of an eagle. "This isn't normal bear behavior." With deliberate slowness, Michael began to move. 20 years of experience screamed at him that this was madness, that approaching a mother bear with cubs was suicide. But something deeper, something more primitive in his gut, told him this was a moment that would define not just his career, but his understanding of the natural world itself. Every step toward the paper felt like an eternity, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. The mother bear remained still, her massive form casting a long shadow in the early morning light. Her eyes followed his movement, but there was no aggression in her posture. Only what Michael would later swear was hope. And when he finally reached the paper, Michael's hands were trembling so badly he almost couldn't pick it up. The note was dirty and torn, but the handwriting was clear enough to send chills down his spine. As he read the words, his face drained of color. "Oh my God," he breathed, looking up at the bear with new understanding. "Amanda, get Dr. Chen on the radio right now. Tell her to bring everything she's got. We've got an emergency situation." The mother bear seemed to understand that her message had been received. She turned to her cubs, gently nudging the injured one with her nose. The small cub's cry of pain echoed through the clearing, and Michael could now see what he hadn't noticed before. The unnatural angle of its back leg, the swelling that suggested something far more serious than a simple sprain. As Amanda rushed inside to make the call, Michael found himself locked in a moment of profound connection with the mother bear. In her eyes, he saw the same fierce dedication to family that he recognized in his own heart as a father of two. This wasn't just a wild animal anymore. This was a mother who had done the impossible, crossing the boundaries between their worlds to save her child. The note in his hand would change everything they thought they knew about wildlife intelligence and maternal instinct. But right now, none of that mattered. What mattered was the trust this mother had placed in human hands, and Michael silently vowed not to let her down. A breeze stirred the trees, carrying with it the promise of approaching winter. As they waited for Dr. Chen to arrive, Michael Thompson stood guard over this unlikely family, wondering how many other secrets the wilderness still held, and marveling at the depths of a mother's love that could transcend the very barriers of species itself. The real story was just beginning. Dr. Elena Chen arrived at the ranger station in record time, her ancient Jeep kicking up clouds of dust as she pulled to a stop. The veterinarian had seen her share of wildlife emergencies in 15 years at Yellowstone, but the scene before her left her momentarily speechless. A mother grizzly bear standing guard over her cubs while Ranger Thompson calmly waited nearby. "The note," Michael said without preamble, handing her the muddy paper. "It's from Tom Reynolds." Elena's eyes widened as she read. Tom Reynolds was a legend among park rangers, a man who'd spent 40 years living in the most remote areas of the park, studying bear behavior. He disappeared 3 years ago during a brutal winter storm, his body never found. But here was his distinctive handwriting, dated just 2 weeks ago. "I've been observing this bear family for months," the note read. "The mother, I call her Grace, is different. She's learned to recognize human writing. I've been teaching her, showing her that paper means help. Her cub is badly injured from a fall into Miller's Ravine. She knows she needs human assistance. What you're seeing isn't just instinct, it's intelligence. Help her, please. And tell Susan I'm sorry I missed our anniversary." "Tom." Elena's hands shook as she lowered the note. "This is impossible," she whispered, but the evidence stood before her. A mother bear who had not only carried a note for help, but had understood enough to bring it to humans. "We can deal with the implications later," Michael said firmly. "Right now, we need to help that cub." He gestured to where the young bear lay trembling against its mother's fur, its sibling standing protective watch. Elena nodded, switching into professional mode. She'd treated injured cubs before, but never with the mother present. Usually they had to tranquilize the entire family, but something told her that wouldn't be necessary this time. "I need to get closer to examine the cub," Elena announced, speaking in the soft, steady voice she used with frightened animals. The mother bear, Grace, watched her intently, and Elena could have sworn she saw understanding in those deep brown eyes. As if in response, Grace gently nudged her injured cub, encouraging it to lie down where Elena could better see it. The other cub, clearly taking cues from its mother, backed away slightly but kept watching with curious eyes. "This is remarkable," Amanda whispered from the porch, where she stood documenting everything with her camera. "It's like she knows exactly what we're trying to do." Elena's examination confirmed Tom's note. The cub had suffered a serious fall. Its back leg was broken, and without treatment, it would never heal properly. But there was more. The break was already showing signs of infection, evidenced by the heat radiating from the swollen limb. "We need to act fast," Elena announced, reaching for her medical kit. "The infection is spreading. Michael, I need you to prepare a sterile workspace in the station. Amanda, get me every dose of antibiotics we have in storage." Throughout the examination, Grace remained extraordinarily calm, only making soft huffing sounds when her cub whimpered in pain. She displayed a level of trust that defied everything Elena knew about wild animals, particularly mothers with injured young. As they worked to stabilize the cub, Elena's mind wandered to Tom Reynolds. She'd known him well. They'd worked together many times over the years. He'd always insisted that bears were far more intelligent than most people believed, that they were capable of complex learning and adaptation. The scientific community had often dismissed his theories as the ramblings of a man who'd spent too much time in the wilderness. But now, watching Grace's careful cooperation, seeing the clear evidence of learned behavior and trust, Elena realized that Tom had been right all along. This wasn't just a story about saving an injured cub. It was proof that the relationship between humans and wildlife could transcend the boundaries they'd always taken for granted. As the morning wore on, more park staff arrived, drawn by radio calls about the extraordinary events unfolding at the ranger station. Each newcomer stood in amazed silence, watching as Grace maintained her peaceful vigilance while Elena and her team treated her cub. What none of them realized yet was that this was only the beginning of a story that would challenge everything they thought they knew about wildlife intelligence, and that somewhere in the vast wilderness of Yellowstone, Tom Reynolds was watching, knowing that his life's work was finally being validated in the most remarkable way possible. As dusk approached, the atmosphere at the ranger station had transformed into something between a medical camp and a miracle witness site. Word had spread through the park service, and vehicles lined the narrow access road, their occupants watching in hushed amazement as Dr. Elena Chen and her team continued their work with the injured cub. The young bear's treatment was progressing better than anyone had dared hope. Elena had successfully set the broken leg, and administered a powerful course of antibiotics. Throughout the procedure, Grace remained a constant presence, her massive form casting long shadows in the fading light, her eyes never leaving her cub. "The infection's responding to the medication," Elena announced, checking the cub's temperature for the fourth time. "But we're not out of the woods yet. He'll need continued treatment, and we can't exactly admit a grizzly bear to the veterinary clinic." No, no, no. Michael Thompson, who hadn't left his post since the morning, stepped forward with a suggestion that would have seemed ludicrous just hours earlier. "What if we don't have to move them? We could set up a temporary treatment station right here. Grace has already shown she understands this is a safe place." Before Elena could respond, a commotion arose from the gathered crowd. A distinguished-looking woman in her 60s was making her way through, her silver hair gleaming in the evening light. The crowd parted respectfully. Everyone recognized Susan Reynolds, Tom's wife and the park's retired head biologist. Susan's face was a mask of controlled emotion as she approached the station. Her hands trembled slightly as she read her husband's note, touching the familiar handwriting with tender fingers. "3 years," she whispered. "3 years without a word, and now this." Grace turned her head towards Susan, and something passed between them. A recognition, perhaps, or a shared understanding of loss and hope. Susan walked closer to the Bear family, ignoring the worried murmurs from the crowd. "You knew him, didn't you?" Susan spoke directly to Grace. "You knew Tom." The bear's gentle huffing sound seemed almost like a response, and Susan smiled through her tears. "He always said you were special. He called you his breakthrough bear in his journals." A ripple of excitement passed through the assembled park staff. Tom Reynolds' research journals were legendary, filled with observations and theories about bear intelligence that many had dismissed as fantasy. But now, with living proof before them, those journals took on new significance. "The journals," Elena said suddenly. "Susan, would they have anything about Grace's previous interactions with humans? Anything that might help us understand how to proceed with the cub's treatment?" Susan nodded slowly. "They're at my cabin. Everything Tom wrote about his work with the bears, especially Grace. He documented years of interactions with her, starting when she was just a cub herself." As night fell over Yellowstone, the Park Service sprang into action. Floodlights were set up around the station, creating a safe workspace for Elena's team. The injured cub, now resting more comfortably thanks to the medication, lay curled against its mother's warm fur. Its sibling had finally relaxed enough to play cautiously with some medical gauze that had fallen nearby, making the gathered humans smile at such a normal display of young animal behavior. Amanda Parker, who had been diligently documenting everything, approached Michael with an observation. "Look at how Grace positions herself," she said quietly. "She always keeps the injured cub on the side closest to the station, where we can easily access him. It's like she's facilitating the treatment." Michael nodded, his 20 years of experience still struggling to process what he was witnessing. "She's not just cooperating," he replied. "She's actively participating in her cub's care. Tom didn't just teach her to recognize writing, he taught her to trust in human help." As Susan returned with Tom's journals, their pages filled with careful observations and detailed theories about bear intelligence, no one could have predicted how the next few days would unfold. They didn't know that Grace's story would eventually reach far beyond Yellowstone's boundaries, challenging scientific understanding and touching hearts worldwide. And somewhere in the vast wilderness of the park, a man who had devoted his life to proving that the barrier between humans and wildlife was more permeable than anyone believed was preparing to emerge from his self-imposed exile, drawn back by the very bear who had become his greatest proof. As the first rays of dawn painted the sky in delicate shades of pink and gold, Susan Reynolds sat on the ranger station's porch, poring over Tom's journals. Her fingers traced the familiar handwriting as Grace and her cubs slept peacefully nearby, watched over by the night shift of rangers. "Listen to this," Susan called softly to Elena, who was checking on the injured cub's bandages. "Tom wrote this entry 3 years ago, just weeks before he disappeared. Grace's capacity for learning continues to astound me. Today, she recognized and retrieved a specific colored flag I'd placed half a mile away when I showed her a matching one. She's not just responding to training, She's demonstrating abstract thinking. Elena shook her head in wonder as she gently examined the sleeping cub's leg. The infection was retreating, thanks to the antibiotics. But what amazed her more was how Grace had begun mimicking the examination routine. Every few hours, the mother bear would gently nose at her cub's bandaged leg, then look expectantly at Elena, almost like a mother asking a doctor for updates. "There's more," Susan continued, her voice catching slightly. He documented years of interaction with Grace, starting when she was barely a year old. He found her trapped in an old hunting snare, treated her injury, and released her. But instead of running away, she kept returning to his research stations. He writes here that she showed an unprecedented ability to recognize patterns and understand human intentions. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted their conversation. Michael Thompson was returning from his dawn patrol, but he wasn't alone. Walking beside him was a man whose wild beard and weather-worn clothing spoke of years in the wilderness. Susan's book fell from her hands. "Tom," she whispered, rising shakily to her feet. The legendary researcher moved slowly toward the station, his eyes fixed on Grace. The bear's head lifted at his approach, and a soft rumble of recognition emerged from her throat. The cubs stirred, the healthy one peeking curiously at the newcomer, while its injured sibling remained nestled against their mother. "I knew she'd do it," Tom said, his voice rough from lack of use. "I knew she'd understand." He turned to Susan, his eyes filling with tears. "I'm so sorry, my love. I couldn't come back until I was sure, until I had proof that everything I dedicated my life to wasn't just a fantasy." Susan stepped forward and wrapped her arms around her husband, 3 years of worry and loneliness dissolving in that embrace. "You stubborn old fool," she murmured against his chest. "You could have told me." Tom held his wife close as he explained to the gathered rangers and veterinary staff how he'd spent the past 3 years living in the remote corners of the park, documenting Grace's extraordinary abilities and those of other bears she'd influenced. He'd discovered that she was teaching her own cubs the trust and intelligence she'd learned, passing on her unique understanding of human interaction to a new generation. "When I saw her cub was injured," Tom continued, "I knew it was time. This was the ultimate test. Would she remember all our work with the paper signals? Would she trust humans enough to seek help for her baby? She exceeded every hope I had." Elena listened intently while continuing her work with the injured cub. "The implications of this are staggering," she said. "This isn't just about one extraordinary bear. This could revolutionize our entire understanding of wildlife intelligence and human-animal cooperation." As if to emphasize this point, Grace rose carefully and approached Tom, gently bumping her massive head against his shoulder in a gesture of familiarity that made the watching crowd gasp. Her injured cub called out softly and she returned to its side, but not before giving Tom a long look that seemed to carry years of shared understanding. "We've always assumed there was an unbridgeable gap between humans and wild animals," Tom said, still holding Susan's hand tightly. "But what if that gap exists only because we believe it does? What if animals like Grace are trying to show us a different way?" As the morning progressed, news teams began arriving at the ranger station, drawn by the incredible story of the mother bear with the note and the return of the famous missing researcher. But for those who had been there since the beginning, who had witnessed Grace's extraordinary trust and intelligence firsthand, the media attention seemed almost secondary to the profound shift in understanding they had experienced. They had seen something that would change them forever, a glimpse of what was possible when humans opened their minds to the true capabilities of the wild creatures they shared this world with. And as Tom Reynolds finally returned home with his wife, Grace stood watch over her healing cub, a living bridge between two worlds that were perhaps not so separate after all. 2 weeks after Grace's extraordinary arrival at the ranger station, Yellowstone National Park had transformed. The small clearing around the station had become a carefully managed rehabilitation area, where researchers and wildlife experts from around the world gathered to witness something unprecedented in the history of human-wildlife interaction. Grace's injured cub, now affectionately nicknamed Scout by the staff, was making remarkable progress. The broken leg had healed cleanly, and under Elena's watchful care, the young bear had begun taking its first tentative steps without the bandages. Each small victory was celebrated not just by the human observers, but seemingly by Grace herself, who would make soft, encouraging sounds as her cub grew stronger. Tom Reynolds, now officially reinstated as the park's lead wildlife researcher, spent his days documenting every aspect of Grace's behavior. But his nights were spent at home with Susan, making up for 3 years of lost time. "The irony," he said one evening, as they watched Grace teaching her cubs to forage near the station, "is that I left to prove bears could bridge the gap between our worlds. In the end, it was Grace who brought me home." The media circus had gradually calmed, replaced by serious scientific interest. Universities and research institutions had begun establishing protocols for studying advanced animal intelligence, with Grace's case as their foundation. But perhaps more importantly, her story had touched hearts worldwide, challenging people's perceptions of wildlife and their capacity for connection with humans. Amanda Parker, the junior ranger who had witnessed it all from the beginning, had become something of an expert herself. Her detailed photographs and observations were being published in leading wildlife journals, and her perspective as a young ranger witnessing these extraordinary events brought a fresh voice to the field. "It's not just about Grace anymore," she explained to a group of visiting researchers. "We're seeing changes in other bears too. The ones who interact with her family group are showing increased problem-solving abilities and decreased aggressive encounters with humans. It's like she's teaching them that cooperation is possible." On a crisp autumn morning, exactly 1 month after Grace had first appeared with Tom's note, Elena performed her final examination of Scout. The cub had healed completely, its playful nature fully restored as it wrestled with its sibling under Grace's watchful eye. The time had come for the bear family to return to the wild. "They don't have to leave," Michael Thompson said, voicing what many were feeling. "We could maintain the research station, continue the studies." Tom shook his head, smiling gently. "Grace needs to be wild. That's what makes her so extraordinary. She chooses to interact with us while maintaining her true nature. Keeping her here would diminish everything she's taught us." The morning of their departure, park staff gathered at a respectful distance. Grace approached each of her primary caregivers in turn: Elena, Michael, Amanda, and finally Tom and Susan. With each, she paused, making eye contact in that unsettling, intelligent way of hers. To the amazement of observers, she gently pressed her forehead against each of their shoulders, a gesture of trust and connection that brought tears to many eyes. Then, with a soft grunt to her cubs, she turned toward the forest. Scout, now strong and healthy, bounded after its mother with renewed energy, followed closely by its sibling. At the edge of the clearing, Grace paused for one final look back at the humans who had become part of her story. "This isn't goodbye," Tom said softly. "She'll be back. Not because she needs us, but because she chooses to maintain the connection. That's the greatest lesson she's taught us, that trust, once built, knows no boundaries." As the bear family disappeared into the wilderness, they left behind more than just tracks in the earth. They left a legacy of changed minds and open hearts, a new understanding of what was possible when humans took the time to listen to and learn from the wild creatures who shared their world. In the years that followed, Grace would indeed return periodically to the ranger station, sometimes with her growing cubs, sometimes alone. Each visit added to the growing body of research about bear intelligence and behavior. But more than that, her story continued to inspire people around the world, reminding them that the greatest mysteries and miracles often came wrapped in fur and carrying notes in their mouths. Tom Reynolds' research station became a center for studying wildlife intelligence, with Grace as its legendary first teacher. And in quiet moments, when the sun set over Yellowstone's vast wilderness, those who had been there at the beginning would remember that extraordinary morning when a desperate mother bear had trusted humans enough to ask for help, and in doing so, had changed everything.